What do you get when you cross divine right with petty tantrums, powdered wigs, and a diamond-encrusted toothpick? You get the British royal family, a fun 200-year soap opera dressed as a constitutional monarchy. Behind the crowns and corgis lies a dynasty built on bizarre rituals, unhinged habits, and enough scandal to make tabloids blush for centuries. These aren't fairy tale monarchs, they're flesh and blood paradoxes, ruling empires while collecting stuffed animals and talking to trees. Welcome to 53 bizarre British royals that are totally true. And yes, every single one of these stories actually happened. Probably. Before we dive headfirst into royal madness, make sure you subscribe, because let's be honest, you won't hear these stories in history class. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We want to know who's joining this weird little royal watch party across time zones. 1. King Charles II's pet spaniels at church. When most monarchs go to church, they bring prayer books, solemn expressions, and the lingering scent of incense. King Charles II brought dogs, specifically Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, a breed so beloved by the king that they followed him like velvet-footed shadows through every hall and chapel. And when he attended church, yes, even during sacred services, they came too, right into the pews, right under the altar, right across the lap of whatever unfortunate bishop dared preach a sermon while one of them barked. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was policy. Charles issued an informal decree that his spaniels were never to be denied entry into any building in the kingdom. Parliament? Sure. The Privy Council? Absolutely. The House of God? Of course. If Charles was allowed in, so were the dogs. To his critics, this was typical of the king's laid-back, pleasure-seeking reign. This was the man who reopened theaters, lifted Puritan bans, installed mistresses in royal apartments, and once turned a royal naval engagement into a floating garden party. That his dogs occasionally disrupted sermons wasn't shocking. It was on brand. But there's something else going on here too. Charles's life had been shaped by trauma, civil war, exile, regicide. He spent much of his youth wandering European courts with nothing but titles and paranoia. The English throne once restored to him came with distrust and danger. But his spaniels? They were safe, loyal, predictable, uninterested in conspiracies. And in that sense, the dogs weren't just companions, they were emotional armor. If the sermon was dull, they gave him something to pet. If the bishops were too self-righteous, the barking gave him a diversion. If the monarchy felt precarious, they reminded him he was still king of something. So while others whispered about sacrilege, Charles smiled. Let the dogs bark. Let them run between the pews. After all, who among them had truly earned their place in heaven? And while Charles brought dogs to worship, Queen Victoria brought mourning to breakfast, clinging, even decades later, to the man she couldn't let go. 2. Queen Victoria's postmortem. Lock of Albert's hair. Grief changes people. For Queen Victoria, it became a lifelong uniform, a daily ritual, a carefully cultivated system of remembrance that bordered on haunting. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the Queen didn't just withdraw from public life. She transformed her entire private world into a shrine. She wore black until the end of her days. She issued commands to preserve his rooms exactly as they had been. And every night, without fail, she placed a small object under her pillow, a lock of Albert's hair. The hair was cut from his head shortly after death, carefully braided, wrapped in silk, and treated like a sacred relic. It wasn't displayed in a glass case. It wasn't worn in jewelry. It was hidden, tucked beneath the place she laid her head, like a child hiding a treasure under their mattress. It wasn't just romantic. It was ritualistic. Victoria believed that by sleeping with the lock of hair, she was maintaining a connection that death had not truly severed. For her, Albert wasn't gone. He was merely elsewhere, waiting in a room she could still reach if she held on tightly enough. This wasn't her only mourning habit. She insisted that his clothes be laid out each day. his shaving basin filled, his chamber pot emptied, his portrait kissed each morning. It wasn't so much about grief as it was about refusal. A queen who could not and would not let go of the one person she had ever trusted without condition. The royal court complied, mostly out of fear. Ministers tiptoed. Servants obeyed. Visitors were instructed never to mention his name unless spoken first by the queen herself. To modernize, it might seem excessive, even unhealthy. But to Victoria, grief was power. She could not control death, but she could command memory. And while her nights were haunted by love, her infamous ancestor, Henry VIII, expressed his dominance with something far more visible and uncomfortably ornate. If you're still with us after that, congratulations. You're officially deeper into royal weirdness than most history professors dare to go. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, because trust me, it only gets stranger from here. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? We're building a global club of insomniacs, skeptics, and midnight monarchists. 3. Henry VIII's bejeweled codpiece obsession. When you think of King Henry VIII, you probably think of the 6 wives, the split with Rome, and the ever-growing waistline. But if you spent time at court in the 1540s, you might have noticed something else entirely. His codpiece. Large, jeweled, ridiculously overstated. The codpiece, originally a functional bit of fabric designed to bridge the gap between 2 leg coverings, evolved into something far stranger under Henry's rule. By the time he reached peak Tudor swagger, his codpieces were miniature thrones of their own, constructed with padding, reinforced with metal, and encrusted with rubies, pearls, and gold embroidery. They weren't subtle. They weren't supposed to be. They were weapons of impression management, aimed squarely at the court, foreign diplomats, and portrait painters alike. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was a king whose masculinity was a matter of national policy. He needed a male heir. He demanded obedience. And if his body, or legacy, was ever questioned, he answered with visual overcompensation. In an era when fertility was both sacred and political, Henry turned his groin into a billboard. You couldn't ignore it. It declared virility, health, and dominance, even as his marriages crumbled and his health declined. In one famous Holbein portrait, the codpiece is nearly the center of the composition, gleaming beneath layers of velvet, flanked by a pose that suggests not just strength, but a kind of royal belligerence. Historians still debate whether this was personal insecurity or calculated propaganda. The truth? Probably both. Of course, all that gold didn't save him from syphilis, ulcers, or a line of wives who mostly met tragic ends. But the codpiece outlived the marriages. It became a legend and a metaphor. Because in Henry's court, the throne may have been in Westminster, but the crown jewels were often right in front of your face. 4. King George III. Talking to trees. Some kings speak in riddles. Others speak in proclamations. King George III spoke to trees. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. In the later years of his reign, specifically during his infamous bouts of mental instability, George was observed walking the gardens of Windsor and Kew, speaking at length to an oak tree he believed was the King of Prussia. He didn't shout. He wasn't violent. He spoke with the calm, deliberate tone of a monarch addressing a peer. Witnesses recorded him engaging in what seemed like diplomatic discourse, asking the king for updates on Prussian troops, discussing alliances, nodding in solemn agreement at the rustling of leaves. Some courtiers were horrified. Others, quietly amused. And still others, perhaps more compassionate, understood that they were witnessing not madness for spectacle's sake, but the fraying of a human mind under imperial weight. George's affliction wasn't diagnosed in his lifetime, but modern historians suspect porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that affects the nervous system. Its symptoms include confusion, hallucinations, paranoia, and, infamously, blue urine, a detail that once scandalized the royal physicians. But the tree? The tree was what stuck. For decades after, satirists drew George mid-conversation with bark and branches. Political cartoons turned his mental collapse into punchlines. Yet under the ridicule there remains something disturbingly poetic. Here was a king trained from birth to speak in carefully edited platitudes, suddenly free to speak with someone or something that never interrupted, never betrayed, never judged. The oak listened, and unlike Parliament, it never talked back. There's a strange dignity in that image, the sovereign of a global empire unburdening himself to a tree, still clinging to the formalities of court even as reality splintered around him. But while George lost his grip on reality, Mary, Queen of Scots, held on to one final loyal companion, even as her head met the executioner's block. 5. Mary, Queen of Scots' pet. Skye Terrier. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was led to her execution on the cold morning of February 8, 1587, she wore a black velvet gown over a crimson petticoat, martyrdom color-coded. She walked with grace. She prayed with dignity. And as she approached the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle, few noticed what followed behind her, a small, trembling Skye Terrier hidden beneath her skirts. The dog had snuck into history. In her final hours, Mary was permitted a few personal effects, a crucifix, a prayer book, a handkerchief embroidered with gold. But the presence of the dog was not officially sanctioned. According to eyewitnesses, the little terrier had been concealed beneath her layers of mourning dress curled close to her legs. As Mary was beheaded, the dog refused to leave her side. When her lifeless body was removed from the scaffold, attendants found the terrier clinging to the corpse, smeared with her blood. They had to physically separate the dog from her remains. This wasn't just sentiment, it was symbolism. Mary's life had been one of betrayal. Her cousin Elizabeth signed her death warrant. Her nobles conspired against her. Her husbands died, fled, or turned treacherous. In a world where crowns changed heads more often than ideas, loyalty was rare. But the dog had remained. After the execution, the little terrier was taken in by one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting and reportedly refused food for days. Some say it died shortly thereafter from grief, though that detail, like much of Mary's life, is steeped in melodrama and Catholic martyrdom. Still, the image endures. A queen fallen, a crown stripped, but a dog remaining, a small heart stubbornly beating in the silence of a sovereign undone. And speaking of small details, Prince Charles, her distant descendant, would come to treasure something far less dramatic, but just as oddly specific: his shoelaces, ironed, every morning. 6. Prince Charles's ironed shoelaces. Say what you want about the monarchy, but attention to detail is one of its core competencies. And few royals embody that principle quite like Prince Charles, a man whose daily rituals toe the line between disciplined routine and full-blown farce. Among the most talked about of these, his alleged insistence that his shoelaces be ironed. Every morning. Reported by former royal staff and widely circulated in both memoirs and interviews, the story goes something like this. Charles, ever the perfectionist, requires that his shoelaces be pressed flat, with no creases, kinks, or folds, so that when they're tied, they lie smooth and pristine against his shoes. To the rest of us, shoelaces are functional, invisible, a minor detail in a chaotic world. But to Charles, they are ritual objects, part of the sacred choreography of being royal. Each morning, his valet allegedly lays out his clothes with surgical precision, the suit on a hanger, the shoes polished to military standard, and the laces, flattened with a hot iron, ready for the day's appearances. Is it true? The palace has never denied it, and the detail has been repeated too many times by too many staffers to dismiss it entirely. But why? Why the laces? It's not about vanity. Charles is famously eco-conscious and even a bit frumpy. It's about order. In a world where every camera angle is scrutinized, every handshake is timed, and every soundbite can be warped into scandal, small rituals become anchors. And maybe that's the lesson. Ironed laces are not about footwear. They're about control in a life that offers very little of it. Shoelaces that never twist. A knot that always holds. A simple private triumph over entropy, one flattened thread at a time. 7. Queen Elizabeth I's lead makeup addiction. It was called Venetian ceruse, a powdery white paste made from vinegar and white lead, favored by noblewomen across Europe for its flawless finish. But no one wore it quite like Queen Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, whose alabaster complexion became one of the most iconic and unsettling visuals in royal history. What began as a touch of cosmetic refinement soon became an armor of aesthetics. By the height of her reign, Elizabeth wasn't merely using makeup, she was masking herself in it. Caking her face with layers of the white poison, finishing it with crimson on the lips and cheeks, she transformed herself into a living portrait. Unnervingly pale, unnaturally smooth, eternally composed. The reasons were both political and personal. A bout of smallpox in 1562 left the young queen with deep facial scarring. In a world where female power was still viewed as a contradiction, blemishes were more than cosmetic. They were threats to legitimacy. So Elizabeth responded by erasing the skin entirely. Her look became mythic. Powdered face, high ruffs, flame-red wigs, and gowns that could suffocate an ox. She curated her image so fiercely that even those close to her remarked on the eerie stillness of her presence. More statue than sovereign. But the lead had a cost. Over time, it poisoned the skin beneath. Chronic exposure led to hair loss, tooth decay, mood swings, and tremors. The more damage it caused, the more she applied. It was a feedback loop of denial. The paint concealed the rot, and the rot justified more paint. In a way, her makeup wasn't vanity. It was a political tool. Elizabeth had no husband, no children, and no successor. She was the monarchy. And so her face became a symbol of unchanging stability, even as her body aged and trembled beneath. By the end of her life, courtiers were forbidden to enter her chamber unless she was fully painted. Mirrors were removed. Servants had to maintain the illusion without acknowledging the reality underneath. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was an icon. And icons, as history has shown us, tend to crack under pressure. But if Elizabeth painted over her decay, Queen Victoria preferred to eat hers, specifically in the form of raw beef and bittersweet chocolate. 8. Queen Victoria's craving for raw steak and chocolate. Queen Victoria, often remembered as the dour widow of Windsor, had a surprisingly earthy appetite, and one particular craving that blended aristocratic indulgence with borderline carnivorous instinct: raw beef and chocolate. Together. Yes, really. At first glance, it reads like a Victorian punchline. But according to records from royal kitchens and memoirs of household staff, Victoria was known to request a rare or uncooked beefsteak, sliced thin, and paired with a generous serving of dark chocolate, either as a separate treat or, occasionally, as a kind of dessert chaser to the meal. There was no fanfare about it, no delicate sauces or French fuss. She wasn't eating foie gras or truffle consommé. This was crude nutrition, dressed in royal silver. Why this particular combination? Historians speculate it was a practical choice as much as a preference. After Albert's death, Victoria's moods became unpredictable. She would refuse food for days, then suddenly devour hearty, protein-heavy meals with startling urgency. The raw beef provided iron, badly needed given her tendency toward fatigue and depression, and the chocolate delivered a sugar spike that helped lift the melancholic fog, at least temporarily. This wasn't steak tartare on a white tablecloth. This was more primal. sometimes described as beef pudding, other times as pressed ox. It was essentially lightly seared or raw meat served cold, sometimes minced, sometimes sliced. Paired with bitter chocolate, another one of Victoria's enduring obsessions, it became a bizarre comfort ritual. Dark, hearty, almost medieval. The Queen reportedly had a sweet tooth all her life. She would snack on chocolate lozenges between audiences. Royal suppliers like Fry's and Cadbury made custom blends just for her, and some were even infused with floral oils or herbs. But when paired with beef, that was personal, almost secretive. One courtier once remarked that, "Her Majesty eats like a lioness recovering from illness, quietly, hungrily, and without pause." The meals weren't refined. They were functional therapy, served on a platter. This strange pairing wasn't published in etiquette books. It wasn't taught at finishing schools. It was just Victoria, grieving, bored, and endlessly encircled by courtiers she didn't like. And sometimes, the only thing that made the endless blur of ceremonial duty tolerable was the iron tang of blood and the bittersweet snap of cocoa. But if Victoria turned to food for comfort, King James III found his sense of security in something far more elusive and far more dangerous: the war against witches. 9. King James VI's fear of witches. For most kings, the threats to their reign come with swords, armies, or poisoned goblets. But for King James III, the true enemy was far harder to detect. It came in whispers, in winds, in curses. It came in the form of witches. James wasn't just wary of witches. He was obsessed. He believed they were real, they were organized, and they were out to get him. The story begins in 1590, shortly after his marriage to Anne of Denmark. Their return voyage to Scotland was plagued by vicious storms. According to James, this wasn't bad luck. It was sabotage by witchcraft. Naturally, when several women in North Berwick were accused of conjuring storms to drown the royal couple, James took a personal interest in their interrogation. And by interest, we mean he led the investigation himself, overseeing confessions, torture, and executions. The idea that witches had targeted him elevated the issue from folklore to national crisis. This was not just a provincial scare. It became state policy. In 1597, James published Demonology, a formal theological treatise that argued for the existence of witches and the necessity of their persecution. He categorized demonic pacts, described methods of detection, and even listed approved forms of examination. It was the kind of guidebook you'd expect from a paranoid bishop, not the King of England. But James wasn't bluffing. He saw witchcraft as a political threat, a spiritual infection, and a direct affront to divine authority. And because the king ruled by divine right, any attack on him, real or imagined, was heresy wrapped in treason. He encouraged witch hunts across England and Scotland. Hundreds of people, mostly women, were arrested, examined, and executed during his reign. He even personally questioned suspects in some trials, probing for signs of the devil's mark. It was a curious contrast. James, the scholarly king who commissioned the King James Bible, was also the monarch who feared old women with herbal tinctures and cats. A patron of poetry who also saw shadows in the hedgerows. But his fear wasn't rooted in ignorance. It was rooted in insecurity. James was a foreign-born king, inheriting the English crown after Elizabeth I's death. He was never entirely accepted by the English nobility. His masculinity was questioned. His alliances were shaky. Witches, real or not, gave shape to his paranoia. In chasing them, he could symbolically chase away his own fragility. He wasn't just hunting magic, he was hunting doubt. 10. King Edward VII's custom-built love chair. Before he became king, Edward VII was better known by a different title: Bertie, the debauched, overfed, irrepressible Prince of Wales. His mother, Queen Victoria, disapproved of nearly everything he did, particularly his deep devotion to food, gambling, cigars, and women. Mostly the last one. It's difficult to overstate the scale of Edward's extracurricular activities. As a royal, he was expected to represent the British Empire with dignity. As a man, he instead chose to represent the empire at the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergère, and a constellation of private boudoirs across Europe. And somewhere in Paris, in a place discreetly nestled between a velvet curtain and a cigar lounge, the love chair was born. Designed by a Parisian furniture maker under Bertie's informal direction, the chair was engineered with a singular purpose: to make intimacy more ergonomically accessible for a man of Edward's considerable stature. He wasn't just heavy, he was expansive. One early biographer described him as a man who occupied furniture as if he'd conquered it. Standard fainting couches could not withstand his enthusiasm. The contraption became legendary in certain circles. It had handles, it had stirrups, it had reinforcements. Some say it folded. Others say it swiveled. Many agree it was embroidered with his initials. Despite how scandalous it may seem now, Edward's dalliances were an open secret. He entertained actresses, countesses, and courtesans. His unofficial friendships often lasted for years and sometimes included diplomatic favors and palace invitations. While the Queen fumed in Windsor, the prince held court in Paris, where his custom furniture became royal myth. But here's the twist. For all his vices, Edward was well-liked. In fact, many people adored him. He was jovial, generous, and surprisingly tactful. European leaders found him easier to deal with than his mother. He could diffuse tensions with a joke, flatter with sincerity, and absorb scandal like a sponge. So when he finally ascended to the throne in 1901, after decades in the shadows, he surprised everyone by becoming a capable and popular monarch. One Parisian journalist wrote, "He was the only man who could turn diplomacy into flirtation and still get the treaty signed." The chair? It never made it to Buckingham Palace. But the legend did. And while Edward was immortalized through risque furniture, Queen Elizabeth II left her legacy etched in something far more sentimental: a private graveyard for dogs. 11. Queen Elizabeth II's secret corgi graveyard. In the grand tradition of British monarchs, Queen Elizabeth II didn't just love dogs. She built an afterlife for them. Corgis were not simply pets to the Queen. They were family members, confidants, and on many occasions, better company than the heads of state she entertained. From her teenage years until the very end of her life, Elizabeth was rarely seen without at least one of the short-legged, big-eared companions trotting at her heels. But what happened after those faithful companions died? She buried them, personally, by hand, on royal grounds. Nestled within the estate of Sandringham House, hidden from tourists and well outside the palace maps, lies a small private cemetery. It's not grand. There are no statues, fountains, or marble arches. Just a collection of lovingly tended graves, each marked with a modest headstone, carved with the dog's name, lifespan, and sometimes a short inscription. The Queen herself often attended or even oversaw the burial ceremonies. Staffers recall seeing her walking the grounds, occasionally pausing to kneel beside a fresh grave. Some say she planted flowers. Others say she wept. None dared ask. One former footman recalled that no other ceremony, no investiture, no wedding, no state dinner, was carried out with more quiet reverence than the interment of a royal corgi. In a life defined by restraint and decorum, the Queen's relationship with her dogs was one of the few places where she showed open tenderness. They were allowed to misbehave at mealtimes. They barked through meetings. They followed her into every room, even the ones her children weren't always welcome in. Some of the dogs were given titles. Others, nicknames. A few appeared in official portraits, perched on velvet cushions beside their royal matriarch. But it was in death that they received their final honor. A resting place among the gardens she loved, beneath trees they used to run under. The graveyard wasn't publicized. It wasn't mentioned in royal documentaries. But it was there, quiet, mossy, private. And in that secluded corner of Norfolk, Elizabeth wasn't a queen. She was simply a woman saying goodbye. But while she buried beloved pets, her husband, Prince Philip, was busy chasing mysteries of a very different kind, in the sky. 12. Prince Philip's UFO curiosity. Behind his famously blunt jokes, brisk walks, and military discipline, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, harbored a secret fascination that wouldn't look out of place in an episode of The X-Files, Unidentified Flying Objects. Yes, really. The Queen's consort, decorated naval officer, royal patriarch, and public grumbler, was a UFO enthusiast. It began in the late 1950s, when Philip received a classified briefing on an aerial incident reported by Royal Air Force personnel. Instead of dismissing it, he became intrigued. What followed was a decades-long curiosity that hovered somewhere between hobby and obsession. Philip began collecting newspaper clippings, official reports, and correspondence from UFO witnesses, civilian and military alike. Through a quiet network of researchers and former service members, he gathered first-hand accounts of strange lights, untraceable aircraft, and unexplained phenomena over British skies. In 1961, he reportedly requested more information on RAF sightings from the Ministry of Defense. Not publicly, not with fanfare, but through a discreet inquiry that raised a few aristocratic eyebrows and left many wondering, what exactly was he looking for? Though he never made public speeches on the topic, those close to him say he took the matter seriously. He didn't speak in conspiracy theories or alien abductions. He was more interested in the possibility, the idea that there were phenomena science couldn't yet explain, and that to dismiss them entirely was unscientific in itself. He even kept in contact with prominent British UFO researchers, including Timothy Good and Nick Pope. Some believe he read early drafts of Above Top Secret, a famous UFO exposé. Others claim he discussed sightings with American military guests during state dinners, though, as always, the palace declined to confirm. To be clear, Philip wasn't boarding up windows or building tinfoil hats. He was a skeptic, yes, but an open-minded one, the kind who believed that some answers only emerge when questions are taken seriously. And perhaps, in a lifetime spent walking behind the woman who symbolized Earth's most traditional institution, Philip looked to the skies for something less predictable, something unbound by protocol. A mystery, a thrill, a reminder that even the most mapped lives still contain unmapped skies. 13. Henry VIII's mechanical throne. In a palace where peacocks strutted across marble floors and jesters risked their necks for a smirk, one of Henry VIII's most prized possessions sat in silence behind a heavy oak door, a gilded mechanical toilet, known rather delicately as a close stool. Now, most royal thrones are metaphorical. This one was very much literal. Henry's toilet was no ordinary wooden seat. It was padded with black velvet, studded with brass nails, and mounted atop a wooden box with hidden compartments and water pans. Some versions were rumored to include a rudimentary flushing system, primitive but effective, a marvel of Tudor-era plumbing for a man who demanded grandeur even while relieving himself. And relieve himself he did, often and dramatically. By the end of his life, Henry was bloated, riddled with ulcers, and reportedly needed help from his groom of the stool, a position so prestigious that noblemen competed for it. The job involved monitoring the king's bowel movements, handing him linen cloths, and keeping detailed notes about his digestion. Yes, this was an actual job. And yes, it came with power, political access, and a certain terrible intimacy. But the throne itself, the velvet loo, represented something more than royal excess. It symbolized Henry's core contradiction. a king obsessed with control who could not control his own body. While he reshaped a nation, splitting the church, dissolving monasteries, discarding wives, his body betrayed him. So he built a fortress around his fragility, including where he sat in solitude. The mechanical throne was about dignity, or at least the performance of it. A man might be in agony, but if he's sitting on velvet and surrounded by gold leaf, then surely he's still a god in human form. Or so the illusion goes. But while Henry had only 3 surviving children from 6 wives, one of his royal descendants would try again and again and again, 17 times, and come away with nothing but silence. 14. Queen Anne's endless pregnancies. She was called the last of the Stuarts, but that makes it sound clean. Finished, closed. Queen Anne's story was anything but. Her reign was defined by war, politics, and the forging of Great Britain. But her private life, the part that never made it into the portraits, was filled with a quieter, crueler war, the war of her own womb. 17 pregnancies. That's not a typo. 17. Of those, only 1 child lived past infancy, and even he, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died at age 11. The rest? Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants gone within days. Some didn't even survive long enough to be named. Anne wasn't just unlucky. She was haunted by motherhood. Her letters are full of aching references to my poor boy, or my little angel, always in the past tense, always edged with exhaustion. She kept mementos of them, lockets, miniature portraits, tiny gowns never worn. And still, she tried again. Part of this was duty. A queen's job was to produce heirs, and without a healthy child, the entire royal succession was in jeopardy. Parliament fretted. Foreign courts speculated. Behind her back, whispers grew louder. Can she even do it? But part of it was also Anne's own desperation for connection. She had few close allies. Her marriage, though stable, was overshadowed by tragedy. Her friendships were intense, often codependent, and frequently ended in betrayal. The babies were supposed to fix something, to anchor her. Instead, they slipped through her fingers. Her body bore the cost. By her early 30s, Anne could barely walk. She suffered from gout, obesity, and chronic pain. She was carried in a sedan chair to Parliament. She'd arrive breathless, skin pale, eyes hollow. But she wore her crown. She smiled. And the court clapped. The irony? Anne presided over the unification of England and Scotland, creating Great Britain as we know it. Yet she could not unite her own bloodline. The throne moved on without her. And in her place rose a new dynasty, one led eventually by a man more focused on appearances than ancestry, a man who wore his insecurities under his coat, or more accurately, under his corset. 15. George IV's corset and wig collection. If ever a man wanted to rewrite his own body with fabric, it was King George IV. By the time he took the throne in 1820, George had spent decades crafting a public image of fashionable grandeur. He was the original royal influencer, flashy, dramatic, overdressed to the point of parody. His enemies called him the first gentleman of Europe, not as a compliment, but as an accusation. And yet, for all his embroidered waistcoats and velvet capes, nothing reveals George more clearly than the things he wore underneath: his tight-laced corset and ever-growing collection of wigs. The corset, reportedly a size 50 by the time of his coronation, was no mere undergarment. It was a vice grip of self-deception, pulled tight each morning by exhausted valets tasked with transforming the portly prince into something resembling nobility. Wearing it was a daily performance. George would hold his breath, pose like a Greco-Roman statue, and deliver proclamations through clenched teeth. His digestion suffered, his mood soured, but his waist, on paper at least, remained slim. The wigs weren't much better. As his hairline receded and gray set in, George amassed an arsenal of powdered wigs, each styled for specific public appearances. Some had curls. Others were swept back with military flair. All were fragile, flammable, and absurdly expensive. He would order new ones obsessively, often discarding them after a single use. His vanity became a kind of theater, a tragic comedy acted out in ivory combs and horsehair. But underneath it all, the man was crumbling. George was overweight, riddled with ailments, addicted to laudanum, and deeply insecure. His public displays of pomp were compensations. The crown didn't hide the flaws, it magnified them. He once said, "My life is one long disease," and many historians suspect that wasn't hyperbole. Still, he was celebrated for the Regency style, which he helped popularize. He created Brighton Pavilion. He threw legendary balls. He cultivated art and architecture. And when he finally died, bloated and half-forgotten, the obituaries remembered the clothes, the corsets, the wigs. They remembered the costume, but not the man inside it. 16. Princess Margaret's morning vodka routine. If Queen Elizabeth II was the face of duty, Princess Margaret was the face of defiance, glamorous, scandalous, and deeply bored by the rigid expectations of royalty. And nowhere did that rebellion manifest more clearly than in her daily routine, which began with vodka before noon and ended with silence, cigarette smoke, and occasional flamingos. Let's start with the morning. Princess Margaret would wake around 9 a.m., give or take, and remain in bed until 11. During this time, she would enjoy a leisurely breakfast, fruit, toast, and juice, served on a silver tray, while reading newspapers and chain-smoking with royal precision. Then came her bath, always drawn at a precise temperature, and always accompanied by more cigarettes and the gentle bubbling of mineral water. She would soak for up to an hour, then drift through an unhurried ritual of makeup, hairstyling, and outfit selection, assisted by her lady's maid. The clothes were dramatic. The jewelry, bold. She dressed like every room might secretly be a stage. By noon, Margaret descended for her first drink of the day, a vodka and soda, measured to imperial standard. It wasn't a party. It was routine. This was how her day began, not with a meeting or memo, but with a chilled glass and a private toast to her own unrushed timeline. And yet, this wasn't just a rich woman day drinking. It was a coping mechanism, elegant, tragic, and deeply performative. Margaret, despite her status, had no real role. She was the spare, always next in line, never central. Barred from marrying the man she loved, pushed to the margins of power, she filled the silence with vodka, wit, and opera. Afternoons might include lunch with friends, a bit of painting, or half-hearted piano practice. Evenings? A dress change, more drinks, more guests. The days blurred together like cocktails over ice, sharp, fizzy, and mostly forgettable. And yet, people adored her. She was funny. She was sharp. She had taste. If the Queen was duty, Margaret was damage, covered in couture and lit by chandeliers. But at least Margaret knew her place in the family. Her uncle, Edward VIII, would give it all up for love and then find himself unable to shake cold hands. 17. Edward VIII's allergy to cold hands. He abdicated the throne. He scandalized the empire. He made monarchy mortal. But Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, is perhaps best remembered for what he couldn't stand: cold hands. The man who once ruled an empire was reportedly so sensitive to temperature that he refused to shake hands with anyone who wasn't pre-warmed. Palace staff and aides were warned. A clammy handshake was a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Visitors who knew the protocol would keep gloves on. Some would discreetly rub their palms together before approaching. A few even carried hand warmers during public appearances, all to avoid the Duke's visible grimace and swift withdrawal if he was met with even the suggestion of a chill. Now, this wasn't a phobia in the medical sense. It wasn't Raynaud's disease or frostbite. It was aesthetic disgust. a blend of fastidiousness and emotional revulsion. Cold hands, in Edward's mind, were not just uncomfortable, they were undignified, inappropriate, vulgar. This small detail, ridiculous as it sounds, was perfectly in character. Edward was a man obsessed with surface elegance. Tailored suits, monogrammed everything, even his breakfast routine was choreographed. He preferred perfectly starched collars and wore suspenders under his pajamas. His bathroom was reportedly clean to within an inch of sterilization. He wanted his world frictionless, and human contact, messy, unpredictable, damp, disrupted the illusion. Even after he abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee for whom he gave up the crown, Edward retained the mannerisms of royalty. His titles were trimmed, but his expectations remained high. He still insisted on being addressed as Your Royal Highness, much to the irritation of his brother, George VI. His cold hand avoidance remained part of the strange little ecosystem that followed him from exile to exile. The irony? Edward's grip on royal duty was already tepid. He preferred uniforms to responsibilities, speeches to policies. His reign lasted less than a year, yet he left behind a seismic constitutional rupture and a memoir full of complaints about bad lighting and rude waiters. But while Edward flinched at frost, his ancestor Elizabeth I faced pain head-on, with a medical experiment involving a bishop, a chair, and a test tooth. 18. Queen Elizabeth I's toothache solution. In an age before anesthesia, antibiotics, or anything resembling gentle dentistry, Queen Elizabeth I developed an agonizing toothache. It wasn't just a dull ache, it throbbed. It distracted her from affairs of state. It made speeches difficult. And worst of all, it made her consider extraction, a prospect so terrifying she refused to let any physician near her. She stalled, she scowled, she snapped at courtiers, but the pain remained, until finally her advisors grew desperate. The Privy Council needed her alert, the court needed her composed, the tooth had to go. So how did they convince the Queen to have it removed? They offered her a demonstration. A bishop, volunteering in either madness or martyrdom, agreed to have one of his own teeth pulled right in front of her, as proof that it could be done without screaming, thrashing, or immediate death. It was the Tudor equivalent of a Yelp review, live, theatrical, and horribly persuasive. The bishop sat. The barber surgeon approached. The forceps were applied. The tooth came out eventually. He may have turned pale. He may have bled. But he did not scream. Not once. Impressed, or at least shamed into action, Elizabeth agreed to the procedure. Now, whether the Queen actually followed through or simply pretended she would, is a point of historical debate. Some records say the tooth was removed. Others suggest she canceled the appointment the moment the bishop limped away. Either way, the moment entered court legend, the Queen who ruled nations but required a bishop's dental demonstration to face her fears. The episode reveals something important about Elizabeth, not weakness, but stubborn pride. She wasn't afraid of pain. She was afraid of looking afraid. For a woman ruling alone in a world of daggers and doubt, fear was a liability. Even toothache had political consequences. So she turned pain into theater, as she did with everything. The scarlet gowns, the lead makeup, the speeches, the glances. Every choice was deliberate, strategic, and shrouded in myth. And this was just another scene in the lifelong drama that was Queen Elizabeth I. 19. King Henry VI, miraculous corpse. In life, King Henry VI was quiet, pious, and tragically unfit to rule. In death, he was, according to some, a miracle worker. The story begins not with a coronation but with a corpse, specifically Henry's own, after he was allegedly murdered in the Tower of London in 1471. He had spent most of his life in confusion and captivity, a king in name but a prisoner in practice. The Wars of the Roses had reduced his crown to a target and his legacy to a footnote. Then he died. Quietly, mysteriously, conveniently, and that, for most monarchs, would have been the end. But for Henry, death was just the beginning of his strangest chapter. Soon after his passing, stories began to circulate. When his body was put on display at St. Paul's Cathedral, witnesses claimed that blood began to seep from his corpse, dripping from the nose, the ears, even the wounds no one could see. This, according to medieval belief, was a divine sign, proof that his death had been unjust. The body, they said, was protesting. The reports spread. Pilgrims arrived. People prayed at his tomb in Windsor. Some even claimed that miracles had occurred at the site. Crippled limbs restored. Fevers lifted. One man's blindness allegedly cured after touching the stone. The church, never one to ignore a good PR opportunity, entertained the idea of canonizing Henry. Yes, Henry the useless. Henry the easily manipulated. Henry the king who lost 2 kingdoms and most of his mind. That Henry. But dead Henry? Dead Henry was holy. Of course, politics got in the way. The Tudors, always wary of popular cults that didn't support their brand, were hesitant to let him rise too high in the afterlife. The canonization effort quietly faded. No halo, no sainthood, just a reputation whispered in abbeys and hinted at in stained glass. What made the story stick wasn't the theology, it was the irony. Here was a man whose life was defined by passivity, but whose dead body refused to cooperate. A king too weak to fight in life, but apparently strong enough to bleed in protest from beyond the grave. In the end, Henry VI was remembered not for his victories, he had none, but for the strange afterglow of martyrdom that followed him. A posthumous PR campaign courtesy of his own leaking corpse. And while Henry bled in death, Queen Victoria orchestrated life, down to the smallest, most absurd details, through her morning notes. 20. Queen Victoria's morning notes to her servants. If control was a religion, Queen Victoria was its high priestess. Every morning, without fail, Victoria would rise early, sit with her ink pen, and begin what might best be described as a torrent of micromanagement, a flurry of handwritten notes and orders directed to her army of palace servants. These weren't grand commands. She wasn't outlining policy or decreeing law. She was noting, in exhaustive detail, everything from how the silver should be polished, to how the footman should open a door, to which of her endless collection of figurines needed dusting first. She would write dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these notes per day. On note cards, scraps, margins of letters. Some were corrections, others were updates. Many were reprimands. One maid recalled being scolded because a vase had been moved exactly 1 inch to the left. Another was rebuked for polishing a mirror too enthusiastically. A gardener received a curt message after Victoria noticed a particular rose bush had developed a rebellious lean. This wasn't tyranny for the sake of cruelty. It was compulsion. Victoria lived in a world that had taken her beloved Albert, that reminded her daily of death, chaos, and the fragility of monarchy. In response, she tightened her grip on the world around her, starting with the teaspoons. Each note was a ritual of control, a small, ink-stained assertion that this curtain tie, this china cabinet, this breakfast tray, would bend to her will, even if time and loss would not. To the staff, it was maddening. There were entire palace rooms filled with archived notes. Servants developed whole systems for sorting and prioritizing the Queen's messages, and heaven help the butler who mixed up Tuesday's sugar bowl with Thursday's. But here's the twist. Victoria read their responses. She followed up. If she told someone to move a lamp, she would check it. If she corrected a seating chart, she expected it to be revised in triplicate. The notes weren't busy work. They were the architecture of her sanity. And through all this, through the ink, the grief, the obsessive control, Victoria maintained the illusion of order. While others ruled with declarations, she ruled with stationery. But contrast this with her great-great-grandson, Prince Harry, who once ruled the headlines not through notes, but through a much more spontaneous kind of exposure. 21. Prince Harry's naked Vegas party. You can take the prince out of the palace, but you can't take the palace out of the paparazzi. In 2012, Prince Harry, then third in line to the British throne, flew to Las Vegas for what was supposed to be a private, off-duty holiday. The kind of trip where a young man recently returned from military service could drink tequila, play some pool, and maybe forget that every move he made was being photographed from space. It did not go well. One night, perhaps two, depending on who's counting, Harry hosted a party in his hotel suite. There was drinking, there were girls, there was strip billiards. Yes, strip billiards. And at some point in the evening, someone with a smartphone captured a now infamous image. Prince Harry, entirely unclothed, covering himself with his hands while grinning like a frat boy at spring break. A second photo showed him playfully embracing another guest, similarly underdressed. The photos, of course, leaked. Not just leaked, exploded. Within hours, they were circulating across every tabloid on both sides of the Atlantic. And within days, they had sparked a full-blown royal crisis. The palace went into damage control. Officially, they expressed disappointment. Unofficially, staffers probably aged 5 years in a week. The Queen remained silent. Charles grimaced. Public reactions were divided. Some said it was harmless fun. Others said it disgraced the monarchy. But here's the deeper layer. Harry wasn't just rebelling. He was suffocating. For a boy raised in the ruins of Diana's media apocalypse, the Vegas photos weren't just a scandal. They were a snapshot of someone trying and failing to have a normal life while carrying an utterly abnormal name. Harry would later say he felt trapped in the institution. The Vegas moment became symbolic, not of lewdness, but of claustrophobia. The royal name follows you everywhere, even to a hotel room with blackout curtains. And yet, what made the incident linger wasn't the nudity. It was the contrast. Here was a prince trained for duty, whose bloodline defined decorum, standing exposed in a party suite under fluorescent lights, looking more free and more lost than any royal ever should. For the firm, it was another reminder that the crown is heavier than it looks, even when you're not wearing it. 22. Prince William's bald joke ban hair is a sensitive subject. For most people, it's vanity. For royals, it's branding. So when Prince William began to lose his famously blonde locks at a young age, palace staff reportedly received an unusual instruction. Don't mention the baldness. At all. Ever. It wasn't an official memo, mind you. No embossed letterhead stating bald jokes are now treason. But insiders have claimed that comments about the prince's receding hairline were strongly discouraged. Banter was not welcome. Even gentle teasing from aides or friends was met with cold silence or quiet retribution. To be fair, William had grown up with cameras in his face since he was in diapers. He knew the value of image, the power of presentation. And as future king, every photo, every profile shot, every tabloid cover became part of the unspoken campaign to maintain his aura of dignity and control. Hair, or the loss of it, wasn't just follicular. It was symbolic. And for a monarchy that trades heavily in visual continuity, every strand mattered. Still, it was hard not to notice the irony. The Windsors had weathered war, scandal, and public divorces. And yet, a joke about a shiny forehead could send the palace into quiet panic. Of course, William himself has reportedly joked about it in private, a self-aware shrug. But the aura around his image remains carefully managed. Less about shame, more about narrative. He is, after all, the stable one. And as the next generation wrestled with image and identity, back in the 17th century, King James II wrestled with something more literal. A baptismal celebration so chaotic, it lit the river on fire. 23. King James II's baptism. Fireworks fiasco. A royal baptism is usually a serene affair. Sacred water, solemn vows, embroidered gowns, and the occasional awkward family photo. But when King James II baptized his son, he aimed for something grander, something theatrical, something that would light up the heavens. Unfortunately, it also lit up the river. In 1688, the christening of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Catholic heir to a very Protestant, unfriendly throne, was not just a religious rite, it was political theater. The birth had already stirred outrage. Whispers of baby-swapping conspiracies echoed through drawing rooms and Parliament alike. So the king, determined to silence his critics and dazzle the public, arranged an extravagant fireworks display. The pyrotechnics were launched from barges on the Thames, and for a moment, it worked. Color, noise, majesty. Then, disaster. One barge, overloaded with fireworks and lacking anything resembling modern safety precautions, caught fire. Sparks flew. A cascade of explosions followed. The barge went up in flames. Some nearby vessels were scorched. Flames licked at the riverbanks. Onlookers screamed. What was meant to be a declaration of royal glory became a floating inferno. The child, thankfully, was nowhere near the river. The king, perhaps less thankfully, was very much in public view. The spectacle cemented the event as more of a cautionary tale than a celebration. It was a metaphor, really. An overstated attempt to control the narrative, only to have the whole thing blow up in your face. James would soon be deposed, fleeing into exile. The baptismal blaze lived on in pamphlets and jokes for years. And while James tried to celebrate his son with fire, Queen Mary would mark her reign with something far more fragile: porcelain. And she couldn't get enough. 24. Queen Mary's porcelain hoarding habit. In an era when royalty measured power in land, armies, and alliances, Queen Mary, consort to King George V, measured hers in porcelain. Fine china, Delft ware, Japanese imari, Meissen figurines, Sèvres vases. She didn't just collect them, she pursued them, relentlessly. Her Majesty's obsession with ceramics bordered on compulsive. She wasn't content to admire antiques from a distance. She hunted them, room by room, estate by estate. When visiting the homes of aristocrats, she would make veiled, or occasionally direct, comments about pieces she fancied. "What a lovely vase," she might say, letting the words dangle in the air like a trap. The implication? A royal suggestion. And few were foolish enough to deny the queen what she clearly admired. These acquisitions often found their way back to Buckingham Palace or Sandringham, where she oversaw their display with the attention of a general commanding troops. She personally directed the layout of collections, moved items from shelf to shelf, cataloged, rearranged, replaced. It wasn't just decor. It was domination. Porcelain as empire. Her obsession was so well known that it became a courtly inside joke. Diplomats began offering rare ceramics as guaranteed conversation starters. Curators dreaded her visits, knowing a single royal glance could empty their cabinets. Some say it was a distraction from the traumas of World War I, the dissolution of monarchies across Europe, and the slow decline of British imperial authority. Maybe so. Or maybe she just liked pretty things. Perfect things. Things that didn't speak, age, or rebel. But while Mary found peace in still, delicate objects, George IV found company in the unseen, including one very talkative ghost with a French accent and a taste for posthumous dinner parties. 25. King George IV's invisible friend. Dinner guest. George IV, formerly the extravagant Prince Regent, had a flair for drama that made Shakespeare look minimalist. He loved fashion, food, furnishings, and flattery. And, if palace gossip is to be believed, he also loved dining with ghosts, specifically the ghost of Napoleon Bonaparte. According to one particularly strange court account, George once claimed to have hosted a dinner where the invisible spirit of the fallen French emperor joined him at the table. Whether the ghost was seated across from him or hovering politely near the cutlery remains unclear. What is clear is that George insisted upon proper place settings, full courses, and conversations conducted in French, though only one side could be heard responding. The claim was not entirely surprising to those who knew him. George IV had a vivid imagination, a gift for embellishment, and a tendency to drink enough brandy to conjure phantoms. But this wasn't just a drunken anecdote. He reportedly believed it. Deeply. So deeply that members of the court played along to avoid offending the king, or Napoleon. At the time, Napoleon was still a controversial figure. To invite him to dinner, even as a ghost, was a politically charged move. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was theater disguised as lunacy, or perhaps the other way around. Some modern historians chalk it up to hallucination, the result of George's worsening health and dependency on medication. Others see it as symbolic. Two emperors, one fallen and one fading, sharing an imaginary meal in the twilight of their power. And while George conjured up imaginary guests, Queen Victoria preferred her dead ones in ink, sketched with love, grief, and unnerving precision. 26. Queen Victoria's drawing of dead relatives. For Queen Victoria, mourning was not an event. It was an aesthetic, a lifestyle, a state-sponsored emotional occupation. And when her loved ones passed away, especially Prince Albert, she didn't just bury them, she sketched them. With pencil in hand and grief in heart, Victoria filled sketchbooks with portraits of the dead. These were not romanticized renderings or idealized images. They were intimate, unflinching studies of faces stilled by death, the shadows under the eyes, the angles of hands no longer moving. Her subjects included her mother, several of her children, and above all, Albert, who appeared again and again, drawn from life, drawn from memory, drawn from beyond. These weren't just drawings. They were rituals, acts of preservation, a way of freezing a moment that could never be reclaimed. In a time before widespread photography, drawing was one of the only ways to keep the dead close, and for Victoria, it was as essential as breathing. She kept the sketches in private albums. They weren't shown at court or framed in galleries. They were hers alone, quiet, personal acts of defiance against forgetting. To some, it seemed morbid. To others, it was the ultimate devotion. A queen with the power to command armies, reduced to lines on paper, trying to capture the slope of a cheek or the clasp of a hand. In grief, she found precision. In loss, she found ritual. And in art, she found control. But not every royal welcomed death so easily. Some fought back, literally. Like the time a princess stared down a would-be kidnapper and made him regret every single decision. 27. Princess Anne's failed kidnapping attempt. It was 1974, and Princess Anne, sharp-tongued, no-nonsense, and always slightly allergic to royal fuss, was riding back to Buckingham Palace in a maroon Rolls-Royce. She'd just attended a charity event. She was with her then-husband, Captain Mark Phillips, and her personal security detail. It should have been a quiet evening. Instead, it became the most audacious attempted kidnapping in modern royal history. On the Mall, just outside the gates of the palace, a small Ford Escort cut in front of the Rolls and forced it to a stop. Out stepped a lone gunman, Ian Ball, disheveled, unhinged, and determined. He pointed a pistol at the chauffeur, then the security officer, demanding that Anne get out of the car. She didn't. She refused, flatly. And then, in the most Princess Anne way possible, reportedly said, "Not bloody likely." While chaos erupted outside, shots were fired, a journalist and a passerby were wounded, and the police scrambled. Anne remained calm, even irritated. Ball insisted again. Anne held her ground. Her body language, according to reports, was pure stone-faced defiance. She later described the moment with the same tone you might use to describe someone trying to borrow your parking spot. Eventually, the situation was diffused. Ball was tackled and arrested. Anne walked away unscathed, though several others were hospitalized for their bravery. She sent flowers. She did not, however, indulge in a media tour or self-congratulation. She returned to her duties the next day. The incident became legendary not because of the violence, but because of Anne's absolute refusal to play victim. She wasn't brave in the cinematic sense. She was brave in the "this is annoying and I have better things to do" sense. And while Anne stared down danger with deadpan disdain, her brother Charles was, at that very same era, talking to beings with much less menace, namely, his favorite potted plants. 28. Prince Charles talking to plants. Long before he became king, Charles, then the Prince of Wales, was mocked, gently and not so gently, for an unusual confession. He talks to plants, and not just talks. He listens to them, encourages them, considers their company. Pleasant. It started as a comment in a 1986 interview when Charles admitted that he found speaking to his plants helped them grow. Britain, naturally, had a field day. The tabloids had never been more delighted. One headline read, "Air today, fern tomorrow." But Charles wasn't joking. He truly believed in the power of communication with nature, not in a Disney princess way, but in a deep, almost philosophical belief that all living things respond to care, intention, and energy. "I just come and talk to the plants, really. Very important to talk to them," he once said, with the serene conviction of a man unbothered by mockery. And the thing is, he might not have been wrong. Botanists and horticulturists have since studied the phenomenon. Some agree that sound vibrations can affect plant growth. Others roll their eyes. But for Charles, it wasn't about science. It was about stewardship. The idea that nature isn't decoration, it's relationship. Plants weren't background. They were part of the family. Of course, critics couldn't resist. In a royal family known for stiff upper lips and fox hunting, Charles became the soft-spoken gardener in tweed, whispering sweet nothings to geraniums. But over time, public perception softened. As environmentalism became mainstream, Charles's once ridiculed views began to look like foresight. What was once eccentricity began to look suspiciously like wisdom. And while Charles was bonding with begonias, his mother was bonding with machinery. Because during parades, even Her Majesty sometimes needed a little mechanical help with the royal wave. 29. Queen Elizabeth II's fake hand. Waving device royal appearances are long. Parades are longer. And Queen Elizabeth II, after decades of waving to endless seas of flag-waving crowds, had earned the right to give her wrist a break without letting anyone notice. Enter the fake hand. Crafted with unmistakably British subtlety and a touch of absurdist genius, the mechanical waving device was essentially a glove affixed to a spring-loaded mechanism. It was placed discreetly inside the Queen's car, tucked into her handbag or resting on her lap, and, with the right nudge, it would gently waggle to the crowd, mimicking the royal wave with eerie accuracy. The invention wasn't a prank. It was practical. Long parades through London or Commonwealth tours involved hours of waving. And while the Queen was nothing if not stoic, even sovereign wrists have limits. So the faux hand waved on her behalf, politely, rhythmically, tirelessly. The idea was allegedly gifted to her by a group of Australian students, more as a joke than a tool. But, with classic Windsor grace, Elizabeth didn't just laugh. She used it. And whether or not it became a regular feature in her car is a closely guarded secret. After all, part of the royal magic is never revealing which gestures are genuine. It's strangely poetic. A queen so practiced in image management that even her wave could be outsourced, an elegant gesture preserved in plastic and springs. And while her subjects waved back in admiration, she might have smiled just slightly behind the glass, knowing the hand they were waving to might not be hers at all. But centuries earlier, a monarch with even stranger tastes ruled England. Henry VIII didn't wave at crowds or whisper to plants. No, He surrounded himself with beasts, real ones, with teeth, claws, and royal titles. 30. Henry VIII's pet monkeys and lions. Henry VIII didn't just rule England, he tried to turn it into his own private menagerie. While modern monarchs keep dogs or perhaps the odd horse, Henry preferred something a little more theatrical. Lions, monkeys, leopards, ostriches. If it had teeth, claws, wings, or scales, he probably tried to feed it raw meat and parade it through the palace. His private zoo was primarily housed at the Tower of London, a fortress that already reeked of intimidation. Add roaring beasts to the ramparts, and it became something closer to medieval performance art. Visitors were sometimes shown the animals as part of the royal tour, a subtle reminder that Henry ruled not only men, but nature itself. The lions were symbols of power, of course. Monarchs across Europe used them as living propaganda. But Henry took things a step further. He had monkeys roam the palace grounds. He brought in exotic birds, and on occasion, treated foreign ambassadors to a viewing of his royal beasts as a sort of diplomatic flex. Nothing says we're not equals like having dinner within earshot of a leopard. The reality was less glamorous. The animals were poorly understood, sometimes caged in tiny, filthy enclosures, and often died within months. But to Henry, they weren't pets. They were symbols, living metaphors for dominance, ferocity, divine right. Much like his codpiece. It's a portrait of a king who believed kingship meant command over all creation. Not just armies and courtiers, but fangs, feathers, and fur. And while Henry surrounded himself with beasts for spectacle, Queen Victoria surrounded herself with just one, a man. Loyal, scandalous, and forever on the edge of propriety. 31. Queen Victoria's Highland servant obsession. His name was John Brown, a rugged Scottish servant with a thick accent, a headstrong temper, and an unshakable devotion to the Queen. But what started as loyalty quickly became legend, scandal, and possibly something more. After Prince Albert's death, Victoria retreated into mourning and into solitude. She wore black for the rest of her life and withdrew from public duties. Enter Brown, one of Albert's former gillies, summoned from Balmoral to attend to the Queen personally. He arrived not just to assist, but to command. Unlike the carefully mannered servants of Buckingham Palace, Brown treated Victoria like a human being. He called her woman instead of Your Majesty, drank heavily, argued openly, and stormed through palaces as if they were barns. And yet she adored him. She described him as indispensable, gave him medals, built him a statue, wrote affectionate letters, insisted on his constant presence. Naturally, the court was horrified. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it romantic? Was he her secret lover? Was he simply a stand-in for Albert? We'll never know. The Queen's journals were mysteriously edited after her death. Entries about Brown reportedly destroyed by her daughter, Princess Beatrice. What remains is the intense, unexplained closeness between a grieving monarch and her uncouth Highland attendant. He was buried with a lock of her hair. She was buried with his photograph in her hand. Was it love? Friendship? A rebellion against the expectations of queenship? Whatever it was, it rattled the palace to its foundation. And speaking of rattling things, King George V once spent a holiday doing something less scandalous but equally bewildering, turning Christmas into a blood sport with over 1,000 birds. 32. King George V's Christmas bird slaughter. There are festive traditions, and then there's what King George V did at Sandringham during the Christmas holidays, an annual pheasant shoot that turned the quiet countryside into an echo chamber of gunfire and feathers. George V was, in many ways, the last of the old world monarchs, stoic, serious, and built for duty. But he had one indulgence that shocked even his contemporaries: mass-scale hunting. Not for survival, not even for sport, for ritual. Each year, at the royal estate of Sandringham, the king and his guests would participate in a shoot so extravagant it bordered on militarized recreation. But the crown jewel of this ritual came in 1913, when George V reportedly shot over 1,000 pheasants in a single day. The official tally was 1,296. That's roughly one bird every 40 seconds, assuming he didn't pause for lunch, which he did. To be fair, he had help. Beaters flushed out the birds. Guns were reloaded by attendants. The whole affair was a precision operation, choreographed like a royal ballet, only with more carnage and less tool. The king himself was an excellent shot, but this wasn't really about skill. It was about dominance, control. A monarch commanding nature, not through pageantry or pets, but through lead and repetition. Afterward, the dead birds were collected, counted, and, supposedly, donated to local families and servants. But one has to wonder, was this about generosity or theater? The press didn't cover it with much criticism at the time. After all, kings were expected to do strange things in private. But it's hard not to read it now as something darker. A man performing order through chaos, tradition through annihilation. And while George expressed power with a gun, his son Edward preferred something shinier. A tiny utensil of unimaginable luxury, fit not for royalty, but for roast dinners. 33. Edward VII's jewel-encrusted toothpick. Edward VII had a gift for extravagance. Even in the smallest gestures, he found ways to insert splendor, status, and just the right hint of absurdity. So it should surprise absolutely no one that the man once known as the Playboy Prince commissioned a solid gold toothpick encrusted with diamonds. Yes, a jewel-studded utensil for post-meal hygiene. The toothpick wasn't a novelty. It was custom-made, meticulously crafted, and allegedly carried in a velvet pouch or discreetly pocketed in a monogrammed case. It would be revealed only after elaborate dinners, caviar, soufflé, roast meats carved tableside, and wielded like a surgeon's scalpel. Quiet, practiced, deliberate. A private ritual made publicly royal. To Edward, it was more than just oral care. It was punctuation, the closing act to a theatrical performance of indulgence. Where others might reach for a napkin, he reached for a tiny object that cost more than most people's homes. In some accounts, he even had multiple versions: gold for formal dining, silver for travel. One allegedly had a sapphire at the tip, because why not? If you're going to maintain dental hygiene in public, why not make it sparkle? Critics scoffed naturally. Even within the royal family, Edward's habits were often viewed with a raised eyebrow and a deep sigh. But to him, the line between necessity and luxury didn't exist. A king, he believed, should never be seen doing ordinary things with ordinary objects. And while Edward polished his smile with precious metals, his ancestor Elizabeth I polished something more ethereal, her scent. And the result was a fragrance closet that could rival any modern influencer's skincare shelf. 34. Queen Elizabeth I's perfume closet. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth I wasn't just a queen, she was an icon. Her face, powdered and painted, had become a symbol of imperial strength, divine right, and eternal youth. But her power didn't stop at visuals. It extended into the air itself. Elizabeth had a perfume closet, not a drawer, not a box, but an actual chamber stocked with over 600 bottles of custom scent. The room reportedly contained flacons of ambergris, musk, rosewater, jasmine, frankincense, civet, and more, each carefully mixed by royal perfumers and apothecaries. Fragrance was considered not only an aesthetic choice, but a shield against disease, bad air, or miasma, and unpleasant courtiers. In short, it was political survival in bottled form. Elizabeth used perfume as an extension of statecraft. When she entered a room, the scent arrived first. She was said to favor strong, musky scents layered with florals, powerful enough to overwhelm both the nose and the nerves. It wasn't just about attraction, it was about domination. Her fragrance was another form of presence, like a crown that floated invisibly ahead of her. Visitors often describe being overwhelmed by the heaviness of her perfume. Some said it clung to their clothes long after they left court. The scent became so deeply associated with her person that to smell it was to feel watched. And in an age when bathing was sporadic and deodorant was a medieval fantasy, perfume wasn't just desirable, it was essential. A monarch had to smell like more than a person. She had to smell immortal. But even immortality couldn't fix a phantom. Just ask Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary Worse, whose body betrayed her in the cruelest of ways, through a pregnancy that never was. 35. Mary was phantom pregnancy. In 1554, Queen Mary made an announcement that echoed across the realm. She was pregnant. The kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang. Prayers were offered, a Catholic heir to secure the Tudor dynasty and undo the years of Protestant uncertainty. Finally, the Queen would fulfill her divine and dynastic duty. Except, there was no child. For months, Mary showed signs. Her belly swelled. Her appetite changed. Courtiers observed her growing with what they believed was maternal joy. A due date was set. The nursery was prepared. But when the time came, nothing. No labor, no baby, just silence. As days turned to weeks and weeks into months, it became horrifyingly clear. There would be no birth. The Queen wasn't pregnant. She never had been. Historians now believe she may have suffered from a condition known as pseudocyesis, or false pregnancy, a rare psychological state in which the body exhibits all the symptoms of pregnancy, without the presence of a fetus. To her enemies, it was a humiliation. To her allies, a tragedy. But to Mary, it was spiritual. She believed the pregnancy was real. When it ended, she was shattered, not just as a monarch, but as a woman deeply invested in the idea of divine justice. She interpreted the phantom pregnancy as a sign of God's displeasure, possibly for her failure to fully restore Catholicism or produce an heir in time. The ghost child haunted her final years. She would never carry again. Her health deteriorated, and her reign unraveled. And yet, while Mary was haunted by a birth that never came, her descendant Charles would become deeply, comically obsessed with a more tangible ritual, a very specific breakfast bowl that no one dared to replace. 36. Prince Charles's favorite breakfast bowl. In the vast, gilded machinery of British royal routine, few things are left to chance. But even within the palace's obsessive choreography, one detail stands out. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, reportedly insists on eating his breakfast from the same bowl. Every single morning. Not just any bowl either. A specific 40-year-old cereal dish, chipped in exactly the right places, fated just so, with a history known only to Charles and perhaps one or two long-suffering valets. When you control an empire of rituals, it seems, consistency becomes its own quiet religion. The bowl's origins are murky. Some say it was a wedding gift. Others say it dates back to his school days at Gordonstoun. But what matters is that it remained unchanged, a symbol of routine in a life built on performance. Each morning, the staff were expected to retrieve the correct bowl from its separate cupboard, because it wasn't kept with the other bowls, obviously, and prepare it with Charles's preferred breakfast items, linseed, granola, maybe a prune or two, depending on the day. He reportedly even traveled with it. Not the contents, just the vessel. Because, while the cereal could be local, the experience had to be familiar. To outsiders, it sounds eccentric, even absurd. But for Charles, a man born into scrutiny, raised in the relentless spotlight of monarchy, and trained from birth to never crack in public, the breakfast bowl may have been the one thing he could control. A small porcelain reassurance that the world, no matter how chaotic, would start the same way each morning. And yet, while Charles clung to morning rituals, his ancestor Henry VIII struggled even to stay intact after death. His final journey was marked not by ceremony, but by something far more grotesque. 37. King Henry VIII's exploding coffin. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the nation mourned. The court prepared elaborate funeral processions. Heralds rode through towns proclaiming the king's death. But for all the fanfare, his final journey was anything but regal. Transporting Henry's body from Whitehall to Windsor required time. Too much time, it turned out. His coffin, made of lead-lined wood, was designed to preserve the remains during the long journey. But Tudor embalming techniques weren't exactly flawless. The body, already bloated from years of illness and excess, began to decompose rapidly inside the sealed coffin. As the cortege paused overnight at Sion Abbey, a former nunnery turned lodging, the coffin began to leak. Then, reportedly, it burst open. The grotesque result left a dark stain on the floor beneath it, one that local monks claimed resembled a bleeding wound. According to legend, dogs were seen licking the floor. The story spread fast. Protestant reformers seized on the tale, spinning it into a moral fable. Henry, the king who had torn apart the Catholic Church, who had beheaded wives and dissolved monasteries, was now being punished in death. His body, they said, was literally rejecting sanctity. Poetic justice from beyond the grave. Of course, historians have since pointed out the physical explanation: decomposition gases, pressure buildup, poor transport planning. But even in clinical terms, the image lingers, the bloated legacy of a monarch too large, too divisive, too human to decay quietly. And so, in death as in life, Henry made a mess. But not all royal rituals were so grim. Queen Victoria, who spent decades cloaked in black and mourning the dead, once paused her solemnity for a very peculiar birthday party involving goats and ribbons. 38. Queen Victoria's Pet Goat Parade. If you think Queen Victoria spent all her time weeping over Prince Albert and writing sharp notes to the butler, think again. Deep beneath the layers of black crepe and courtly gloom beat the heart of someone who really loved goats. Not just goats in the abstract, specific ones, adored, pampered, and, on at least one occasion, paraded with royal pomp. It began during one of her visits to Scotland, where she was gifted a small herd of goats from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. They weren't just livestock, they were mascots. Victoria took a shine to them, particularly one named Billy, who became something of a celebrity on royal grounds. So fond was she of Billy and his fellow caprine companions that she once held a birthday party for them. The goats were dressed in decorative sashes and rosettes. A band reportedly played. Servants were expected to maintain composure as ribbons were tied around the horns of bleeding celebrants. Whether the goats understood the ceremony is questionable. But for the Queen, it was a joyful absurdity, a break from mourning and governance alike. She even ordered official portraits. Watercolor sketches of her beloved goats hang alongside her more traditional pet portraits. While her dogs were famously buried in a private graveyard, the goats got pageantry, though their final resting places remain unrecorded. To her, they were not just animals. They were symbols of loyalty, whimsy, and maybe, just maybe, a kind of domestic normalcy no courtier could provide. And while Victoria paraded goats in tartan, her descendant Edward VIII would dance his nights away in Paris ballrooms, even long after he'd danced his way off the throne. 39. King Edward VIII's dancing obsession. When most people abdicate a throne, they retire to a life of quiet disgrace, a country house, maybe the occasional memoir. But Edward VIII, once king for less than a year, chose something different. He chose the dance floor. After abdicating in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee and, more importantly, someone his government refused to accept as queen, Edward didn't fade into the background. He turned exile into an extended cocktail hour. Paris, Cannes, the south of France, wherever the champagne flowed and the music played, the former king twirled right into the center. Edward was obsessed with ballroom dancing, and he wasn't casual about it. Even after his abdication, even as Europe teetered on the brink of war, he maintained a strict routine. Tailored evening wear, polished shoes, and hours spent practicing waltzes, foxtrots, and tangos with Wallace, or occasionally paid instructors. To him, dancing wasn't just a pastime, it was salvation. In public, it kept up appearances. In private, it was a form of control. His life, once dictated by ancient rules and political pressures, could now move to rhythm, precision, and glamour. He installed dance floors in multiple residences, hosted parties where the guest list included Hollywood stars, exiled royals, and the odd spy. People say he never truly stopped moving. He just danced from one hotel lobby to the next, his tuxedo and title a little more worn with each twirl. It was escapism, yes, but also stubborn pride. If he couldn't be king, he could at least be the best-dressed man doing the quick-step in Paris. And while Edward spun away from the weight of duty, his cousin Philip held tight to something far less fanciful, the wheel of a car, until age nearly caught up to horsepower. 40. Prince Philip's driving license at 97. Some men gracefully hang up their driving gloves in their 70s. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was not most men. At 97 years old, Philip was still behind the wheel, cruising the back roads near Sandringham like a man half his age. That was until January 2019, when the world was reminded that time, and traffic, waits for no royal. On a quiet country road, Philip's Land Rover collided with another vehicle. His car flipped. Eyewitnesses said it rolled like a toy tossed across the tarmac. Miraculously, he emerged uninjured. Shaken, yes. Bloody? No. But the occupants of the other car, 2 women and a baby, weren't so lucky. While the child was unharmed, the adults suffered minor injuries. A media firestorm ensued. The nation was divided. Some praised the prince's toughness and resilience. Others questioned why a man pushing triple digits was still operating heavy machinery. The palace issued a rare statement. Philip reportedly was deeply sorry, but less than 2 days later he was seen driving again, this time without a seatbelt. Critics were apoplectic. Headlines exploded. For a family built on image management, this was a PR pothole of epic proportions. Within weeks and under immense pressure, Philip voluntarily surrendered his driver's license. But it wasn't just about mobility, it was about independence. Philip had spent most of his life walking a half step behind his wife. In his car, he was in charge. Behind the wheel, he was not a consort, he was the captain. The crash marked the end of an era. The Duke no longer drove himself, but he never fully yielded. Because for a man like Philip, giving up the driver's seat meant more than aging. It meant arrival at the one place no royal ever wants to admit they're heading. And while his license was retired, others claimed someone else wasn't finished wandering palace halls, especially not after death. 41. Princess Diana's ghost sightings. The legacy of Princess Diana was never going to be quiet. She was a global icon, a media obsession, and a deeply complicated figure whose death in 1997 left a wound not just on a family, but on a nation. So it makes a strange poetic sense that people began to see her long after she was gone. Over the years, several guards, staff, and visitors at Kensington Palace, her former residence, have reported what they claim are ghostly sightings of Diana. A silhouette drifting past her old bedroom window, the faint sound of footsteps in an otherwise empty corridor, a perfume scent with no source. One staff member allegedly resigned after an encounter so vivid they refused to walk that wing alone again. Most of the stories follow the same structure. Quiet moments, soft light, the sudden overwhelming sense of presence. Never angry, never malevolent, just there. As if Diana had never truly left, as if the building itself couldn't bear to let go. Ghost stories surrounding royalty aren't new. Hampton Court brims with them. Windsor Castle has entire ledgers of reported hauntings. But Diana's is different. Hers feels more recent, more emotionally unfinished. A life cut short. A tragedy televised. A myth still forming. To those who loved her, the sightings are comforting. To skeptics, they're echoes of collective grief. But whether spirit or symbol, Diana remains a presence too large to be contained by a tomb. And just as her admirers clung to signs and silhouettes, the followers of King Charles I clung to something even more tangible, strands of hair, clipped from a decapitated head, because sometimes relics matter more than resolution. 42. King Charles I's hair collector. When King Charles I was executed in 1649, he didn't just lose his crown. He became a relic, a martyr to royalists, a cautionary tale to republicans, and, in a strange twist, a collector's item to those with a taste for the macabre. Because after his death, some of his most loyal followers did something very specific. They collected his hair. Moments after his beheading outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, cold morning, silent crowd, executioner masked, the royal body was removed for burial. But not before a few mourners took advantage of the opportunity. They clipped strands of his famously dark curls, keeping them as sacred souvenirs. This wasn't a grim novelty. It was devotion. For royalists, Charles wasn't a failed monarch. He was a saint. His death wasn't justice. It was sacrifice. And in an age where holy relics were fading from Protestant practice, this was a way to anchor belief in something physical, something you could hold. Lockets, rings, and reliquaries were made to encase the hair, often worn against the skin like a hidden vow. These keepsakes became treasured family heirlooms, passed down through generations like fragments of a fallen god. Some were inscribed with phrases like "killed for the church" or "martyr of monarchy." They weren't just mourning tokens, they were political statements. Today, a few of these strands survive in museums and private collections. Brittle, faded, fragile, but still unsettling, still real. A lock of hair that once sat atop the head of a king who believed he ruled by divine right, and died insisting he was answerable to no court on earth. But while Charles's hair became a symbol of devotion, Queen Elizabeth II preferred something more subtle and more coded. Because when she wanted to leave a conversation, she didn't speak. She simply shifted her handbag. 43. Queen Elizabeth II's purse code. In public, Queen Elizabeth II was the image of serenity, impeccably dressed, unflappable, unfailingly polite. But beneath the calm, she wielded an arsenal of silent signals, none more clever than her use of the royal handbag. To the casual observer, it looked like any other stylish accessory. But to palace aides, it was more like a bat signal, a system of nonverbal cues honed over decades of diplomatic endurance. Because when you're queen, and you've spent 70 years trapped in small talk with ambassadors, dignitaries, and the occasional dictator, you need an exit strategy. And the purse? That was it. The rules were simple. If Her Majesty moved her handbag from her left arm to her right, it meant she wanted to wrap things up. If she placed it on the floor, it signaled immediate extraction, the royal equivalent of pulling a fire alarm. And if she twisted the handle, aides knew to prepare for an elegant yet swift departure. These cues allowed her to maintain the illusion of endless graciousness without ever breaking character. No need for awkward interruptions or whispered excuses. Just a graceful tilt of the arm, and the wheels of escape were already in motion. The system was so subtle that most guests never noticed. They left feeling honored, seen, and blissfully unaware that they'd been tactically ejected by a handbag. The Queen's purse was more than an accessory. It was an instrument of sovereignty. In a world where every word mattered, silence became her sharpest tool. But while Elizabeth used discreet signals, her ancestor George III exhibited something harder to ignore. Because when his mind unraveled, even his urine turned blue, and the doctors were as baffled as they were horrified. 44. King George III's blue urine. By the time George III was seen talking to trees, babbling incessantly, and signing documents backwards, most of his court had accepted a difficult truth. The king was unwell. But the symptom that puzzled his doctors most, the one that still sparks debate centuries later, was this. His urine turned blue. Yes, blue. Accounts from his physicians describe the king's urine taking on a striking discoloration during his periods of mental instability. For years, the cause remained a complete mystery. Was it a strange diet? A side effect of treatment? A symptom of madness itself? Modern historians and medical experts have proposed a fascinating theory. Porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can, in some forms, cause reddish or bluish urine due to the buildup of certain pigments. Porphyria also aligns with many of George's other symptoms: sensitivity to light, abdominal pain, erratic behavior, and cycles of lucidity followed by confusion. If true, it would mean that one of Britain's most famously mad monarchs was actually suffering from a treatable genetic disease centuries ahead of its time. But no definitive diagnosis exists. Some argue the blue urine detail is apocryphal, a myth invented by over-imaginative physicians or sensationalist biographers. Still, the story stuck. Because there's something chillingly poetic about it. A king trying to hold together an empire while his own body turned into an enigma, leaking symptoms no one could decode. He spoke to trees, he saw ghosts, he urinated sapphire, and in the chaos of his reign, the line between medicine and mystery blurred completely. But if George's body betrayed him in ways he couldn't control, his ancestor Elizabeth I took control of something more symbolic, her image, by banishing every reflective surface she could find. 45. Queen Elizabeth I's fear of mirrors. By the end of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I had become more myth than monarch. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the immortal figure in white lead and red wig. But behind the powerful imagery and divine rhetoric was a woman growing older, and increasingly afraid of her own reflection. Elizabeth, once celebrated for her striking beauty, became deeply uncomfortable with mirrors as age crept in. According to accounts from her later years, she removed most mirrors from her private chambers, or demanded that they be covered entirely. Any servant who left one uncovered risked sharp rebuke or sudden unemployment. Why the aversion? It wasn't vanity in the modern sense. It was identity control. Elizabeth had constructed a persona so elaborate, so elevated, that to see herself as merely human, aging, and mortal was psychologically destabilizing. The mirror threatened to break the illusion, and when your authority is tethered to myth, cracks in the myth are cracks in the crown. Portraits from her later years reflect this. They're highly stylized with no signs of age, no wrinkles, no decay. Her image was not a face, it was a symbol. Eternal, untouched, sacred. Even as her teeth blackened, her hair thinned, and her body weakened, she remained publicly untarnished. Because no one was allowed to see the real woman, including perhaps herself. It's a haunting irony. A queen who saw everything, spies, suitors, strategy, couldn't bear to look in the mirror. And she wasn't alone in trusting strange reflections. Another Henry, her father, once trusted the stars themselves to guide his most personal choices, even if they often led him to ruin. 46. Henry VIII's obsession with astrology. For all his bravado, Henry VIII was, in many ways, a deeply insecure man, and like many powerful figures of his time, he looked to the stars not just for comfort, but for answers. Astrology wasn't a fringe curiosity in the Tudor court. It was a royal advisory tool. Henry consulted astrologers and soothsayers before major decisions, declarations of war, treaty negotiations, even marriage plans. Charts were drawn, birth dates examined, celestial alignments were studied to divine the ideal moment for nearly everything, including coronations and royal births. This wasn't superstition in the modern dismissive sense. To Henry, astrology was both science and statecraft, a divine language woven into politics. Court astrologers such as William Perrin and others were highly respected, even feared. If the stars warned of misfortune, plans changed. If they suggested strength, Henry acted boldly, sometimes catastrophically. He reportedly scheduled major state events based on favorable planetary alignments. Some believe his decision to marry Anne Boleyn was bolstered by an astrologer's optimistic prediction of a male heir. Spoiler: the stars were wrong. But when things went awry, Henry didn't blame the cosmos. He blamed the interpreters. Several astrologers lost favor, or worse, when their forecasts failed. Much like his wives, the stars had to align perfectly, or be replaced. It was a belief system that allowed him to externalize uncertainty. The stars made the call, not him. Destiny was pre-written, and kings were merely its instruments. And while Henry looked to the heavens, modern royals often turned inward. Sometimes far too inward, like one prince whose bedtime routine involved an army of stuffed animals, all placed just so every single night. 47. Prince Andrew's Stuffed Toy Army. Among the many odd tales surrounding Prince Andrew, few are as quietly bizarre or revealing as his lifelong attachment to dozens of stuffed animals meticulously arranged on his bed. The story came to public light in the 1990s, when a former royal maid gave interviews describing the exacting routine required each time Andrew's room was cleaned or prepared. It wasn't just about tidying, it was ritual. Each stuffed toy had a designated place with a laminated instruction sheet outlining where and how each should be arranged. Some sat at attention, others reclined. A few were placed in specific social groupings, as if the plush animals had their own unspoken hierarchy. And heaven help the staff if they got it wrong. If even one bear was out of place, Andrew reportedly became irritable, demanding corrections. It wasn't a childhood habit outgrown. This was adulthood, and the bears remained. Psychologists might call it regression, a coping mechanism, a way to control the environment in a life otherwise dominated by public scrutiny and royal rigidity. Others saw it as simple eccentricity. But in the context of his other controversies, the story took on a darker, more surreal quality. A man of immense privilege, still clinging to a world where bears follow orders and no one talks back. And yet, within the walls of the palace, no one seemed especially surprised. Royals have always had their rituals. For some, it's handwritten notes or velvet chairs. For Andrew, it was an army of plush confidants, silent and obedient. But perhaps the most enduring royal ritual belonged to Queen Victoria herself, who, in mourning for decades, didn't just wear black. She made everyone else do it too, for 40 years. 48. Queen Victoria's Mourning Veil Law. The world lost Prince Albert in 1861. Queen Victoria lost something far more personal: her reason for standing upright. Albert had been her constant, her intellectual equal, her political advisor, her companion in an otherwise isolating institution. When he died, Victoria didn't simply grieve. She rewrote the script for what grief was. She put on a black veil, and she never took it off. Her mourning was not symbolic. It was totalitarian. The veil became a kind of second skin. Made of black crepe or bombazine, it cloaked her face for over 40 years. It was not a temporary stage of loss. It became her identity, and she expected the world around her to accommodate it. She wore it to state functions, royal audiences, and private walks through Balmoral. The silhouette of a veiled monarch became the enduring image of the late Victorian era. Solemn, distant, wrapped in memory. But it didn't end with her. The Queen enforced a strict mourning dress code on everyone in her orbit. From her ladies-in-waiting to the most junior staff at court, black became the only acceptable color for decades. Her personal attendants were required to wear mourning attire for Albert for as long as they served her. Footmen wore black breeches. Maids wore black aprons. Even the decor of royal residences was altered. Mirrors were covered, drapes were darkened, and portraits of Albert were placed like icons in every hallway. The effect was eerie. To visit Queen Victoria after Albert's death was to enter a house of perpetual twilight. Guests noted the silence, the absence of music, the weight of it all. Even her writing changed. Letters filled with underlined grief, meticulous instructions about commemorations, and emotional micromanagement of memory. There's an oft-repeated story that she kept a set of Albert's clothes laid out every morning in his old dressing room. His shaving bowl, his robe, his boots. Unworn, untouched, but not unseen. Servants were instructed to maintain them as if he were simply delayed, as if death were just another absence. The veil, then, was not just mourning, it was denial woven into protocol. It transformed personal grief into institutional culture. The Victorian age itself was swathed in black because one woman's heart refused to beat without its other half. To the public, it was either touching or tyrannical, depending on your politics. Some saw it as the ultimate expression of fidelity. Others whispered about obsession. But whatever it was absolute. And while Victoria buried herself in fabric and memory, her descendant George IV did something far more theatrical. He resurrected himself in fiction, claiming to have fought in a war he never saw. 49. King George IV's fake war wound. George IV always had a flair for the dramatic. He wore corsets until his ribs bruised, changed outfits 5 times a day, and once imported a chandelier so large it cracked the ceiling. But perhaps his most theatrical invention was himself. Specifically, a version of himself that had ridden into the chaos of the Battle of Waterloo, sword raised, bullets flying. There's just one issue with that heroic narrative. George IV was nowhere near Waterloo. He wasn't even near Belgium. But that didn't stop him from telling the tale. According to multiple sources, George claimed to have fought in the battle, leading cavalry charges and sustaining a heroic leg wound. He told friends. He told foreign dignitaries. He may even have told himself. Of course, the real hero of Waterloo was the Duke of Wellington, who, by most accounts, rolled his eyes whenever George's fantasy came up. Wellington, never one for subtlety, once said, he was in no condition to fight any battle but one with his tailor. Why invent the story? Well, George was painfully aware of his public image. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, he was already seen as soft, indulgent, and effeminate. England was hungry for military glory. He, by contrast, was hungry for pastries. Creating a tale of personal valor was his attempt to bridge the gap between the man he was and the king he wanted to be remembered as. The fake war wound became part of the myth, spoken in salons, hinted at in letters, maybe even reinforced with the occasional limp at dinner. In a way, it was performance art. George IV didn't need to win the war. He just needed people to imagine that he could have. It was monarchy as cosplay, self-invention as statecraft. And while George pretended to be wounded, Queen Elizabeth II didn't pretend at all when it came to her nightly habits. She had a private ritual, simple, refined, and utterly British, that helped her manage the weight of ruling every day, and it came in a very small glass. 50. Queen Elizabeth II's secret martini habit. Queen Elizabeth II was famously disciplined. No public scandal, no raised voice, no undone button or wrinkled skirt. She gave away almost nothing of herself for 70 years, and that was exactly the point. The monarchy didn't exist to feel relatable. It existed to endure. But even monarchs have their routines, and Elizabeth's included a quiet, private pleasure that rarely made the headlines, a martini, or more precisely, a Dubonnet and gin. Every evening before dinner, she was said to enjoy a small glass of the royal concoction, 2 parts Dubonnet, a sweet, fortified wine-based aperitif, 1 part gin, a slice of lemon, and 2 cubes of ice. It wasn't a party drink. It wasn't even particularly strong. It was, more than anything, a ritual. Her former chef, Darren McGrady, confirmed the habit. The ingredients were always kept stocked at royal residences. It wasn't the drink itself that mattered so much as the consistency. In a life where even footsteps were choreographed, the small act of raising a glass became a powerful assertion of control. Some reports, though unconfirmed, suggested she also enjoyed a small glass of champagne before bed. Add in a midday sherry or wine with lunch, and tabloids were quick to exaggerate. But anyone close to her knew. Elizabeth was not a drinker. She was a ritualist. The martini wasn't rebellion, it was reassurance. A pause between duty and rest. A few quiet moments where no one asked her opinion, no one handed her a speech, and no one expected her to wave. It also said something larger about her reign. While her predecessors were flamboyant, erratic, and often chaotic, Elizabeth ruled by habit. Steady, measured, tidy. Even her vices were disciplined. So as she sat each evening in Balmoral or Windsor, sipping her Dubonnet and gin, she wasn't indulging. She was sustaining. Not just herself, but the very image of monarchy she had carried for a lifetime. But not all royal gifts came in glasses. Some were much, much stranger. Because once, for reasons best left to regional eccentricity, Prince Charles was given something no one could really explain. A throne made entirely out of cheese, and yes, it melted. 51. Prince Charles's cheese enthronement. Gift royal birthdays tend to come with predictably refined gifts. Antique watches, rare paintings, ceremonial swords, maybe a new spaniel. But when Prince Charles, now King Charles III, celebrated a milestone birthday, he received something unprecedented. A throne. Not carved from wood, not gilded in gold, but sculpted, quite sincerely, from solid blocks of British cheese. A literal cheese throne. The gift came from a group of artisan cheesemakers from southwest England, loyal subjects with an agenda. Their hope was to both honor the prince's vocal support of local farming and, more strategically, to boost public awareness of traditional British dairy products. And what better way to draw attention than to build a 20-stone edible monument to their monarch-in-waiting? The throne was constructed primarily of Somerset cheddar, stacked and sculpted to mimic a high-backed chair, complete with armrests, footings, and a wedge-shaped crown at the top. It was technically impressive, if slightly unstable in warm weather. The structure stood at roughly 4 feet tall and was built with such detail that it included a plaque inscribed with the phrase, His Royal Rindness. Charles, of course, took the whole thing with grace. A longtime champion of sustainable agriculture, he's not new to eccentricity. He's talked to trees, redesigned entire villages, and once transformed his Aston Martin to run on wine and cheese byproduct. So when the dairy throne arrived, he reportedly gave a wry smile, thanked the creators, and joked about resisting the urge to sample it. The press had a field day. Headlines like, Prince Charles gets cheesed and a throne fit for a dairy king popped up across British tabloids. The throne itself became a brief media sensation before reportedly being dismantled, sampled, and donated to local charities and food banks, though not before several palace aides posed with it for internal Christmas cards. In its odd way, the cheese throne reflected something essential about Charles, a man who carries centuries of tradition while always leaning, ever so slightly, into the surreal. A royal who might be mocked for taking himself too seriously, except when he doesn't. But while Charles received a throne you could melt on toast, Henry VIII once commissioned portraits you could fall in love with, or be trapped by. Welcome to Royal Tinder Tudor Edition. 52. Henry VIII's Royal Tinder Portraits. Before dating apps and filtered selfies, there was Hans Holbein and his paintbrush. In the 1500s, Henry VIII, the Tudor monarch with a marriage resume longer than a Shakespearean soliloquy, had a very particular approach to choosing his queens. He didn't swipe left, he sent painters abroad. Henry's version of online dating involved diplomatic portrait hunting. When his third wife, Jane Seymour, died, Henry didn't just grieve, he immediately began shopping for a fourth. But rather than travel Europe meeting potential brides, he commissioned Holbein and other court painters to bring the ladies to him in oil. One of the most infamous results of this process was the portrait of Anne of Cleves. She was the sister of the Duke of Cleves, a Protestant ally Henry hoped to woo for political purposes. Holbein was sent to capture her likeness, and the resulting painting showed a modestly dressed, soft-featured woman with delicate hands and a demure gaze. Henry, upon seeing it, agreed to the marriage. The deal was sealed before he ever met her. But when Anne finally arrived in England, Henry reportedly panicked. The real woman, he declared, looked nothing like the portrait. He was repulsed. "I like her not," he reportedly muttered to his courtiers. The marriage was awkward from the start. It was never consummated, and 6 months later, it was annulled. Anne, for her part, handled it gracefully. She accepted the title King's Sister, received a generous settlement, and lived out her life comfortably in England. Holbein miraculously kept his head, though the fiasco put a dent in the king's trust in portraiture. This wasn't a one-time misjudgment. Henry relied on portraits throughout his life to evaluate women he never met, trusting paint and brush over personality. The irony, of course, is that Henry himself heavily controlled his own image, demanding that court painters depict him with heroic posture, massive legs, and impossible grandeur. He wanted godlike perfection in his future queens, while editing his own reality like a medieval influencer. So next time you think a dating app photo seems a bit too flattering, remember? Henry VIII walked so catfishers could run. And while he looked for beauty in brushstrokes, Queen Elizabeth II once found high-stakes entertainment in a far stranger place, a frog race. And yes, she won. 53. Queen Elizabeth II's frog-jumping bet. Even monarchs need to unwind. For Queen Elizabeth II, whose reign spanned 70 years, much of her leisure time took place at Balmoral Castle, the Scottish estate where protocol softened, boots replaced heels, and the press was politely kept at arm's length. It was there, during a summer evening among close friends and family, that the Queen found herself at the center of a frog-jumping competition. The details are hazy. Some claim it was in the 1960s, others place it later, but the story has remained a cherished part of royal lore. The event itself was informal. A group of guests, including members of the royal family and estate staff, had gathered near a pond. Someone proposed a game. Each participant would select a frog from the surrounding marsh, place it at a starting line, and see which amphibian would leap the farthest toward a finish line marked with twigs and stones. The Queen, always a quiet competitor, chose her frog carefully, small, alert, and apparently spring-loaded with determination. A gentleman's wager was placed, £5 to the winner. A small sum for anyone, let alone the monarch, but the thrill was in the chase. On the signal, the frogs were released. They bounced, stalled, backtracked, and leapt with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But the Queen's frog, true to its training, or perhaps its natural sense of royal obligation, bounded straight down the course and crossed the finish line with a triumphant splash. Laughter erupted. The Queen smiled, not her polite public smile, but her real one, wide and slightly mischievous. She accepted her $5 winnings with mock formality and reportedly said something along the lines of, "One must know how to back the right frog." It was a fleeting, playful moment, unofficial, unrecorded, and entirely human. In the midst of constitutional paperwork, ceremonial waves, and endless formalities, this was Elizabeth unguarded. A woman who ruled with gravitas, but who also once crowned a frog the evening's champion. And just like that, the story hops from curiosity to legend. Because even the longest reigning queen in British history occasionally bet it all on a frog.